right, welcome back. This week we're going to be talking about one of the greatest writers who has ever lived. And you probably haven't heard of him if you're not Chinese. His name is Du Fu. Now, Du Fu wrote in the 8th century in China, which is possibly another reason why you haven't heard of him. And he wrote poetry, which is possibly yet another reason why you haven't heard of him. Typically, when I introduce a poetry unit in my classes, there's this almost audible groan, like, oh my gosh, poetry again, I hate poetry. And you can be forgiven this attitude because my experience in most high school English classes is that it just sucks the life right out of poetry. It presents it as sort of this secret code. And if you can unravel the code, if you can figure out the deep meaning behind the words, like the words don't actually mean what they say they mean something very different, right? That's not the way poetry works. If we had a whole year to work on it, I'm sure we could really dig into it. We only have a couple of weeks, and it's all going to be in translation, which is going to add a little bit of a wrinkle to it, but we're going to do our best to deal with it. But today, I'm just going to talk about one aspect of Du Fu. We're going to do it in two parts. The first lecture is going to be why Du Fu is a big deal in Chinese. And the second part is going to deal with the obvious question, which is, that's great that he's so awesome in Chinese. We're reading this in English. This is the common thing. If I have Chinese students out there who are listening to this, I guarantee they're thinking to themselves or saying to each other, really? You're going to teach Du Fu in English? That's ridiculous, right? And to some extent, of course, they're right. It's a truism that you just can't repeat this stuff. You can't translate the real Du Fu, right? You have to read Chinese for that. But we're going to present this in English in such a way that you can still, I hope, appreciate some of at least what Du Fu is doing. So today I'm going to get into a little bit of why Du Fu was such a big deal when he wrote, which was a long time ago, and why he continues to be a big deal. We are going to be talking about the poem Spring Scene. This translation is by Cai Zongxi, although you do also have translations by Stephen Owen and David Hawkes. Now, this is an example of a Luscher poem. Now, a Luscher poem doesn't really have a good translation in English, but it's highly regulated. This is important because Du Fu was a master of pretty much all the poetic forms of his day. Stuff that had a lot of rules, stuff that didn't have a lot of rules, which means he had a lot of options and chose whatever options seemed to express what he wanted to say in the moment. Now, this is also important because, as you should by now have already figured out from having read especially David Hawkes' translation, Du Fu was writing in the midst of one of the worst tragedies, one of the worst catastrophes in human history, the Anlu Shan Rebellion. The final death toll was somewhere between 13 and 36 million lives, and I'd have to double check the actual figures, but I do believe until the 20th century that was the costliest conflict in terms of human life in history. Odd that we don't really know anything about it, or that, we can read about it, but whenever we study world history, we tend not to learn about it. It is instructive that Du Fu chooses to use certain poems and certain poetic styles that are highly regulated in order to express utter horror. We're going to talk about why that matters as the course goes on, but let's start with this poem here. As I say, this is a Luscher, and I'm going to read the English, and then I'm going to read the Chinese as a way of letting you see one of the biggest differences between how poems feel in English and how they feel in Chinese. So the English reads, "The country is broken, but mountains and rivers remain. The city enters spring, grass and trees have grown thick. Feeling the time, flowers shed tears. Hating separation, a bird startles the heart. Beacon fires span over 3 months. A family letter equals 10,000 taels of gold. My white hairs, as I scratch them, grow more sparse, simply becoming unable to hold hat pins." The Chinese reads, 国破山河在，城春草木深，感时花溅泪，恨别鸟惊心。烽火连3月，家书抵万金，白头 骚更短，浑欲不胜簪. You'll notice the Chinese feels a little sing-songy. That is because Chinese words, especially in the classical era, are monosyllabic. English has a ton of different syllables. Mountains, rivers, there's monosyllables, separation, 3 syllables. All the Chinese characters are 1. So there is no other way to read. You can speed it up, you can slow it down, but it's still going to feel a little that way. It also feels sing-songy because the rhythm and the meter are so highly regulated. It's also incredibly concise. When we get into how to appreciate this stuff in translation, you'll still be able to catch some of this. It's incredibly concise, and it gets across a lot of meaning in a very short space. This is the word-for-word translation, which I will not read. You can read it when you want. But the important thing to point out is that there are 40 total words in the poem. 36 indicate actual things or actions, and only 4 are quote-unquote empty, as in they add color but don't actually do much on their own. Right? English or Western poetry in the classical tradition often is loaded with fancy language, or what feels like fancy language now. This tends to be one of the barriers between people really appreciating poems, right? Because you first encounter this stuff probably in high school and think, oh my word, can we just get to the point? Part of the point in the form in the past, in the West, was being able to demonstrate your prowess with the language. And part of the poetic form required you to do that. The poetic form here is exactly the opposite. How much can you fit into a tiny space and very few words? Okay? There's not even a personal pronoun. This is huge, and we'll talk about why in a minute. There's no I in this poem. So, the other thing is that although there's only a few words, there are also rules for what happens in a single line. Each line has a disyllabic unit followed by a trisyllabic unit, which simply means there's an idea in 2 syllables followed by an idea in 3 syllables with a break or a caesura in between. Wonderful, snotty literary term. Memorize it and use it in conversation to amaze and impress family and friends with how smart you are. It's just a place you're supposed to pause, either to breathe or just to add drama. So here in the Chinese would read 国破, pause, 山河在. The country is broken. That's a whole thought. You could stop there. Pause, mountains and rivers remain. Every line must have that. 2, pause, 3, right? Now again, if you're a poet and you're working in this, that means everything has to be very carefully chosen. If you're reading it, when we read guo, or the country, the poet had to have spent a long time thinking about exactly why this character, this word, and not another, because he doesn't have a lot to work with, and it has to complete a thought in 2 characters. This thing and this thing together have to be a 1 unit with a pause, and then be related to this one. That's a lot of thought to put into a single line. Now, in strict Luscher poetry, which is, of course, Du Fu is writing here, the 2 middle couplets are also required to be parallel thematically. So, Tsai has given us a nice list here, but feel and hate, which are emotive verbs. Time, separation, have to do with time and space. Flower and bird, the natural world. Tear and heart, nouns related to emotions. Shed and startle, emotional responses, etc. So think about writing this sucker, okay? You're starting off with only 40 words, so you already are fairly limited with your choice. These 2 have to form a unit, and these 3 have to form a unit. And these 2 also have to be related to these 2 somehow. So you're thinking about this as a unit, and this as a unit, this as a unit, this as a unit. Just in 2 lines. Not only that, but Du Fu follows one of the optional rules in the form, which is sort of like a narrative progression. So you start with the qi, which is a beginning or an arising, cheng, which is continues and elaborates, the zhuan, which makes a turn, and the he, which is to conclude. So, starting off, you have kind of a collision here. The country's broken. This is bad, but everything else is fine, right? The city is in spring. The country may be broken, but the city's in spring. The grass and the woods are out. The mountain rivers are all there. All the stuff that is necessary for the natural world to thrive is still in place. The only thing that is broken is the human world. Again, all of that bound up into one single word. It's also interesting, just to point this out, that spring, anywhere you go in any culture of literature, tends to mean the same thing. It's peace. It is prosperity, flourishing, hope. In Chinese as well, this when you read spring and you think to yourself, wow, you just get a certain connotation for it. Well, the Chinese has exactly the same thing, which is interesting. We move on to the Cheng couplet, which is right here. This is the poet turning his gaze inward. So we have hearts and tears. There's sadness happening here. However, the poet does not give us any personal pronouns. He does not say, I feel this, right? So this isn't just me trying to be deep, but you can read this just about any way you want. Is it, for example, down here, Tsai points out, I feel about this wretched time so badly? Or just in general, feeling the wretched time? Who? Anybody. It could be 1,000 people. It could be one person. It could be that the flowers are somehow feeling the wretched time. Now, it's fascinating to think about this style because it is rigid in some ways, right? We have this 40 character limit. We have the syllabic limit, thematic limit. We have a rhythm that's limited. But then when we get here, it's wide open. It's highly restricted and yet wide open as well. Are the flowers feeling enough sadness to shed tears? Is there an I who is feeling these things and he's watching the flowers shed tears? Is it that the person is feeling bad and the flowers make him or her shed tears? All of these are included on purpose. Now we get to the turn, and we get to things of humanity. And again, there's a lot packed in here, right? The beacon fire. That's already usually a signal of war, or at least of sending messages a long distance that are very, very important. We have letters. We have currency. A lot of stuff is packed into a short space. And it's also a big deal. A beacon fire, 10,000 gold TL, home letter. So things are bad, right? Just sending a letter is expensive and difficult, right? So we've gone from things being bad for humans, good for nature, to the poet reflecting on sadness, to things in the human world being rough. Now, you would expect from there to go to something perhaps bigger. He is talking about a catastrophe after all. He's talking about huge amounts of blood being shed. He's talking about lives being taken, families torn apart. Surely he would end with a thought that brings that home for us, right? But where does he bring us to? A hairpin. He talks in his last two lines. Remember, of course, that each character in this line has to be very carefully chosen, and he chooses to spend all of that energy and space on someone talking about white hair growing sparse, so sparse that it can't hold a hairpin. Now, to me, just personally, this is possibly the biggest reason why Du Fu is so brilliant, is that his poems, if you read enough of them, you will see that they all feel like a slice of life, a real slice of life. This is not something being played up for effect, at least not always. He could end a lot of ways. He chooses to end with the most basic, simple detail you can imagine, which is someone who's growing old or possibly someone losing their hair out of stress. And you could simply say losing hair out of stress, but instead he brings it down small enough to a hairpin. Someone who is lamenting a point of vanity. My hair is so thin that I can't put this little piece of jewelry in it. Such a human thing to worry about in the midst of a time when all of that has been taken away. It's such a poignant way to end a poem like this, to bemoan very basic, ordinary things. And it points us back to here, right? The poet, the speaker anyway, is reflecting simply on how nice it would be to not care about all this, right? That this is something that is perhaps vain, but also so human,